So we'll get started. I'm Dr. Rachel Coons. I'm a criminal justice faculty member here at Penn State College. I also advise Rebecca Hart on her honors project, Mental Illness in America's Detention Facilities. It has been an honor to work with Rebecca, and I am so proud of her, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say. I know what she has to say, but she's going to do great.
Yes. So this is my honors presentation, The Silent Voice, Mental Illness in America's Detention Facilities. This is my overall disclaimer. There are some points that I may describe violent acts, either committed by offenders or described by offenders. If you at any point feel uncomfortable that you need to leave, please do so. I am willing to still answer questions after. It'll all be okay. By no means feel that you need to stay. Yes. As of late, Nebraska has had a few reasons it's been in the spotlight, particularly with the prison systems, and specifically it has been with how much money is spent on making new buildings. In 2022, the budget that was set aside for a new building was $230 million, which, believe it or not, is a lot of money. And there are many reasons why they give that there are new buildings being built, but one of the main reasons is overcrowding. While a new building is a great thing to have and it can make punishments more humane for different offenders, it doesn't solve the root causes of overcrowding. What is one thing that we could do is to focus on mental illness, which is the focus of this presentation and my honors project. Specifically, we will focus on how America's justice system treats people with mental illness, how mentally ill offenders are reintroduced to society and their recidivism rates, and options for mentally ill offenders. So first off, how the justice system treats people with mental illness. This specific study looks at relationships between substance abuse disorders and mental illness. Oftentimes they are found to be comorbid, co-occurring, and this is what this study found as well. The specific population for this study found that after 4 years, 60% of people with mental illness and or substance abuse disorders recidivated. And recidivism, to explain, is the rate at which an offender is rearrested and sent back to prison. Okay, in prison, many mentally ill offenders experience violent interactions, and they are usually the victims in these situations. And any issues that they experience at a higher sense due to said mental illness. And unfortunately, due to these issues and their lack of coping mechanisms and how they can think through these problems, there is a higher rate of suicides in prison systems by mentally ill offenders. Between 2001 and 2019, 4,500 suicides occurred in federal and state prisons, and that was an 83% increase over that time. So it's clear it is an issue and it's a growing problem, so it's something that we still need to work on. One of the reasons that mentally ill offenders have less coping mechanisms is PTSD and PIS. PTSD, known as post-traumatic stress disorder, is something that is fairly well known, and it can happen with a few number of things. It can happen with war, it can happen with prison, or violent interactions. But PIS is post-incarceration syndrome, which is a subset of PTSD, which is attributed solely to how offenders are treated in prison and the effects thereafter. Okay. Reintroduction into society and the recidivism. This specific study looks at arrests in Indiana between 2014 and 2015. Almost 1/3 of these arrests specifically had mentally ill offenders being arrested, and more than 1/4 of them had substance abuse disorders. Still showing that it is comorbid, so it's not specific to a specific time or a specific place. It is all across America at any time. There's also a higher rate of rearrest as well and recidivism. Programs for treatment in prisons are shown to help these situations, not only because they offer treatment, because you could argue if the treatment is good or bad, that's up for debate. But it also gives opportunities for evaluations and check-ins, which shows currently how prisoners are doing in the system. The best punishment for mentally ill offenders are diversions from jail to community sanctions. And this can be probation, parole, etc. There are a few options. And the reason for that is because mental illness can diminish the culpability of offenders, which can lead to said not being able to cope with different interactions in prison and leading to harsher outcomes. Options for mental health treatment out of prison. This specific study looks at a specific community treatment where mentally ill offenders were sent to a high-intensity community program. This only went on for 3 months, so it's up for debate if it was the perfect study or not. It is not the perfect study. No study is perfect. But it does show that even within 3 months, there were improved behaviors and risks of recidivism. So it shows that it could definitely be a step in the right direction to have offenders in community sanctions. But other options are halfway houses. There are not many halfway houses for mentally ill offenders, specifically in Nebraska and across America, but the few that are there are showing great improvement for different offenders. And that is particularly because these are good for offenders that need access to community, but also a higher level of supervision, because they will be living with other offenders, but also with the people supervising them. So it works out great for those specific offenders. Probation and parole are the main sanction that's offered for community options. But this is while it's more common, it is severely overworked and some argue underpaid. But because of how much work that each probation officer could have, it's often not possible for them to get to every single mentally ill offender and have them do all the evaluations they need and get the help they need, which still leads to higher risks of recidivism. While one could argue if we have more funding, if we have more officers, and if we have more training, then probation will be perfect. But at this point, that's just speculation. Okay. Up until this part was the literature review, where we addressed America's justice system and how it treats mentally ill offenders, their reintroduction to society and recidivism, and options for mental health treatment. This, as it was the literature review, next we will be looking at Nebraska's justice system, particularly Nebraska's prisons and mental illness, cases specific to Nebraska, and issues with Nebraska's justice system currently. And after these 3 points that we addressed, we will also go over a proposal to Nebraska's legislature. Nebraska's prisons and mental illness. This specific study addressed different things, different statistics of mental illness in different states. And looking at Nebraska, on June 30th, 2005, there were approximately 7,406 offenders in prisons and jails. And approximately how many of those that were seriously mentally ill was 1,185. While that might not seem like a lot, it does not give much insight into that. They also calculated the number of people in state, private, and psychiatric units in general hospitals, and that was 688. The fact that there are more mentally ill offenders currently in our prisons than in hospitals where they need to be there to get the treatments that they are necessary, it says a lot about how our justice system has been treating offenders with mental illness. The odds of a seriously mentally ill person being in jail or prison compared to being in a hospital where they can get treatment is 1.7 to 1. Could be worse. Nebraska is not the worst out of all the states listed, but it has room for improvement. Nebraska is also listed as number 38 in amount of money spent on mental health. Definitely room for improvement there. Could be a lot worse, but could be a lot better. Looking at cases specific to Nebraska, this is Nico Jenkins. Curious character as he is. In 2013, Nico Jenkins killed 4 people in 3 separate shootings. He was arrested, tried, and found guilty in 2019. He is currently on death row. The reason he is such an interesting case is that he was in prison before for drug and assault charges. During that time, certain Nebraska prisons were trying to find different ways to alleviate the problems of overcrowding. So they had meetings with different offenders to see if they were well enough to go out into the world. He had his meeting with the officials of the prison, and he stated that during his time in prison, his mental and physical health has greatly deteriorated, to the point that he stated that if he was released, he he was going to kill people, drink their blood, and consume their bodies. While he did not consume their bodies in the end, but they still did choose to release him after this, despite him saying that he needed help. Because during his time in prison, he was kept in solitary confinement at one point for 23 hours without any of his medications, which led to one thing after another, and many instances of him hurting himself, hurting others, and as he said, his mental and physical health greatly deteriorating. Yes, he was found to be insane at the time of the murders he committed, so there was an appeal sent to the Nebraska the people doing the death penalty, and the Nebraska Supreme Court denied this appeal and basically said that he was still going to be held accountable for these crimes. This case is extremely prominent right now in Nebraska due to the fact that it is currently showing a mentally ill offender going through our justice system and being held for a crime that normally mentally ill offenders would not be held accountable for. So it's still being debated, it's still being fought through, but as of now, he's still on death row without a specific date to be put to death. This is Aubrey Trail, another case specific to Nebraska. In 2017, Aubrey Trail and his girlfriend, Bailey Boswell, killed Sidney Loof in his apartment. It is unclear specifically how it all went down, but he did plead guilty to this. And according to his testimony, he invited Sidney Loof as a Tinder date into his home. Once she showed up and he invited her in, he shut the door and introduced Sidney to his girlfriend Bailey and said that she was there to be their third. They were looking for a different type of lifestyle than most relationships do in America currently. According to Aubrey Trail, she had such an outlandish reaction that he saw no choice other than to kill her and dismember her body. Bailey Boswell is also being convicted for murder in the first degree. Yes, but the main reason that Aubrey Trail is in prison currently, and the reason he is in the news at this time, is that he recently reached out to different news outlets, not to appeal the death penalty, which is what he is on. He's on the death row. He basically stated that to quote him currently, "You gave me the death penalty, now use it." He has been on death row a similar amount of time compared to Nico Jenkins, and Nebraska is currently having issues with finding the drugs to do lethal injection, which is putting many people's death time, pushing it farther and farther back, which many would say is less humane than we should do. This is compared to Nico Jenkins in the case that they are both currently going to be put to death, and they're both waiting on their trial on that. But there is a difference between the two in that Nico Jenkins is being debated if he was culpable for his crimes. Aubrey Trail, that is not up for debate. It is known by him and everyone else in the justice system that he did do this. But Nebraska's justice systems right now. These two people up here are Kevin Carter on the left and Angela Bull on the right. Kevin Carter was in prison for charges of terroristic threats and assault with a deadly weapon. He had a sentence of 6 to 9 years, and he would have been eligible for parole in April of 2022. Bull, he had a sentence to life in prison for first-degree murder. He suffered from severe mental illness, which consisted of paranoia, delusions, and violent psychotic outbursts towards others and himself. This is a case that is currently a lawsuit against the Nebraska correction system due to the problem of overcrowding that has been occurring. Due to overcrowding in our justice systems and our prisons, there are certain cells that may be holding more prisoners than it is allotted to. Carter and Bull were both put into solitary confinement together, which seems counterintuitive. But they were put in solitary confinement together, and during that time, Bull had a violent outburst and strangled Carter in November of 2020. So Bull and Carter did lose his life. But Angelo Bull was found not guilty of this murder by reasons of insanity. While it is a greatly unfortunate situation for everyone involved in this, it shows two important things about our justice system right now. One, there is someone currently in our prisons that is not receiving the help that he needs. He was off his medications at the time, and they were not able to give him the help and separation from other offenders that was needed there. And two, the sheer amount of overcrowding that is happening there is causing dangers between prisoners and to officers. Yes, but this right now is the proposal to Nebraska legislature that I wrote. And this will address issues with how Nebraska's justice systems handle mentally ill offenders. And as you can see, it is titled Proposal to Instate More Options for Mentally Ill Offenders Currently in Prison. Okay. As you can see, this is my executive summary. It is a bit wordy. You can read it if you'd like, but long story short, it is addressing different issues with Nebraska's justice systems and focusing, instead of going to sending people to prison, to possibly send them to community-based corrections. Okay. In the introduction here, Nebraska's prisons are currently overcrowded to the point of danger for prisoners, as well as anyone else that has a relationship with them. In June of 2005, Nebraska had 7,406 people in jails, and at the time, 185 of them were estimated to be seriously mentally ill, as this was addressed earlier in my presentation. The lack of help for the mentally ill and the overcrowding in Nebraska's prisons has led to issues including the lawsuit pertaining to Angelo Bull taking the life of his cellmate Kevin Carter. Focusing more on other options for sentencing mentally ill offenders will help with overcrowding, help offenders get the treatments they need, and help lower recidivism rates. And this here is the problem statement that I have. The state of Nebraska has a focus on punishment rather than treatment or rehabilitation when it comes to sentences and for crimes. This has different results. These include overcrowding, high rates of recidivism, and high costs. There are too many people in Nebraska prisons to currently hold all of them in penitentiary buildings. Having options for community-based corrections and having them live separated from other offenders is both safe for them and cost-effective. The high rates of recidivism has been referenced multiple times in this, but community-based corrections has been shown to have better options for mentally ill offenders, and almost any offender, but we're focusing on mentally ill right now. And high costs. Choosing to house offenders in prisons for extended periods of time is much more costly than choosing to have community-based corrections. So having community-based corrections options available gives more options to eligible offenders to see what is best for them and what will better society. Okay. And proposed legislative action. These will include increased funding, criteria for eligibility, oversight, and partnerships. For increased funding, we will call to allocate more funds that are currently being used on penitentiary buildings towards funding community-based corrections opportunities. These will focus on treating serious mental illness, treating substance abuse disorders, and services to help reintroduce back into society. And the criteria for eligibility will particularly fall on offenders that have an official diagnosis or serious mental illness disorder, and prisoners that are deemed by prison officials, such as prison psychologists and prison wardens, to need community-based corrections. The oversight for this will consist of bi-weekly check-ins for different offenders. This can be done at different times to help alleviate workloads for people working in these systems, but at the very least it needs to be done bi-weekly, and these will help keep tabs on offenders and if they are improving or not, and it will give current information on what parts of this will be working for offenders. And partnerships, that's referencing to the fact that this will be more doable if this can be done in partnerships with different nonprofit organizations. That does restrict to different areas, while some areas might have more options for nonprofit organizations and other areas might not have those organizations. or the organizations might not be willing to help. Yes, the justification for action includes lower recidivism rates, humane punishment, and treatment and check-ins. The treatment and check-ins is referencing earlier. It gives better insight onto who is actually improving and what is helping. But lower recidivism rates, as is mentioned before, community-based corrections greatly helps mentally ill offenders in reducing risks of recidivism and improving on different behaviors that can help with a smoother transition from finishing a sentence to going back into society. In the humane punishment, this, as mentioned before, it looks at the fact that mentally ill offenders have issues lots of times with our prisons as they are currently. And having an option for community-based corrections, if they qualify for it, gives more options of them gaining coping mechanisms during this time. Yes, this is the fun part, financial implications, because money is the most important thing to some people in this situation. For the savings issue, in 2016, it was estimated that $34,770 is what it costs to imprison an offender for 1 year. While on the other hand, for a residential reentry center, it costs only $29,280 per year. While residential reentry centers might not be exactly what these community corrections will look like, it is very similar in the fact that it will help offenders gain skills to re-enter back into society with lower risks of recidivism. And the sources of funding, in 2023, Nebraska spent $185,900,000 on corrections, which, as mentioned before, is a lot of money. Choosing mentally ill offenders who would benefit from community-based corrections and moving them to such corrections would greatly benefit them and save the state thousands of dollars per offender. Yes, but to conclude this portion of the Nebraska legislature proposal, choosing to have more options for how offenders serve their sentences is a step forward for Nebraska's justice system. Not only would this be cost effective, but would also solve the problems of overcrowding and recidivism rates. This proposal urges the state of Nebraska to consider this thoughtful consideration, and as you can see, it is signed by me. And to conclude this presentation in total, we did go over the 3 sections that we addressed were the literature review of this presentation, Nebraska cases and how the justice system has been working, and a proposal to Nebraska legislature. Mental illness is overrepresented in our justice system. That's not perfect, and nor should we expect it to be perfect. That's unreasonable. But what we should expect is to be able to adapt and change when we find problems like these. This is the type of change that we need to have in our justice system in order to be humane for everyone, not just mentally healthy offenders. Yes, and here's, I had a lot of sources, there's 2 of them, yes. Any questions?
So do you think the reinstitutionalized centers, the community centers would be the best option for that? Or do you think it would be the combination of having some slightly better resources in some of the prisons for some of those mentally ill people?
That's a really good question. I think as of now, it is the best option because considering the fact that it is so much cheaper to have a residential reentry center or community-based corrections, that money that we could save from that, I think then that could be more realistically allocated back to prisons for different resources like better counseling or classes, things like that. But I think as of now, we need to find a way that is realistically going to save money and help the state rather than just be like, oh, we can do this. This is good. I don't know how we're going to do it, but I think it's going to start there though.